This week, state budget cuts hit Virginia's public colleges, fraud, waste, and abuse within the Virginia Economic Development Program, and protests take off across the state against Donald Trump's presidential win. This and the rest of the weekly news roundup on the For Virginia podcast, coming now. Thanks and welcome to the For Virginia podcast for the week ending November 19th, show number 13. I'm your host, Michael Brennan Wade. Thanks for tuning in. For Virginia is a state political action committee focused on supporting progressive causes and candidates at the local and state level. Our weekly podcast is meant to provide you with news and analysis of politics across the state, helping you get the information you need to be an informed citizen, battle right-wing propaganda, and to help progressives organize and activate where we are most needed. Now, usually at this point, I ask you to share on social media, but tonight we have a very actionable and specific request. We'd like to raise $100 this week to purchase newspaper subscriptions for our various sources for the rest of the year. Places like the Daily Press, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and a lot of the smaller newspapers across the state either have a firewall or don't allow access for non-subscribers. And we get our leads from VPAP, but in order for us to actually read the article, we have to have a subscription. So we think that $100 will help us get some of these subscriptions out of the way. Richmond Times, I think, is about $52 a year. So we'd like to get those started to cover us for at least the next couple of months and be able to actually bring you some detail on these articles rather than just some of the synopsises that we get from VPAP. So put the link out to our ActBlue page. Please consider contributing $5 or whatever you can do, or even a recurring donation would be even better if you can possibly afford that. And again, we appreciate all the help that you guys give us and all the love. I do need to get something out of the way. I am officially a candidate for the General Assembly. I live in the 91st District, which is Hampton, small portion of Hampton, most of York County, and all of the city of Poquoson. So I have filed my paperwork, made my announcement, and I'm putting together my campaign staff for the 2017 election. Yes, I did not get enough of the 2016 presidential race and decided to just go straight into it. So, but that's separate from here. MichaelWadeForDelegate.com is our website. We're separate from For Virginia. I want this to be a space to talk about statewide efforts and everybody else that's doing great work. So I won't talk too much about my run or make too many appeals for donations and stuff like that. I may chime in from time to time, but for the most part, I'm going to try and keep this focused on the state instead of just my little corner of it, but we'll see how that goes. As always, I'd like to ask you to go to our website at forvirginia.org, where we post the show notes with links to all the sources that we reference. Share the podcast on social media, follow us on Facebook, and help us get the word out. We'd also like to hear any feedback that you have either through the Facebook page or by emailing info@forvirginia.org. We're going to continue with news. We'd like to start with updates on things that we've talked about in the past. So let's get started. Actually, one more thing before I do go into recurring news. We didn't address the election last week. If you're wondering where last week's podcast was, we decided to take a little different tact. We did a little experiment on air. We went live and we took phone calls, or a phone call would be more specific, but we tried to do some Facebook video live, had a little technical difficulties that we were working out. I thought it went pretty well after we worked out some of the kinks. But for some unforeseen reason, possibly music licensing issues, Facebook decided to delete our video after we taped it. So I don't really have a specific answer as to why that happened or not, but pretty good reason why. And it's very hard, and we're not doing it this week. We fell back to the pre-records because it takes a lot of work to do this. I spent about 2 hours just going through news sources before I start taping, and trying to do that live is really crazy. We will probably do it again at some point in the future. Not saying when, but I think if we schedule something, 10 to midnight might be a little too out there for some people, but we're talking to some friends who are doing a online radio station, and we may eventually make a thing out of it. But for tonight, I wanted to just fall back to my comfort zone. I think part of the reason why we did it that way last week was because of the overall crushing election results, and just wanted to mix it up a little bit. So unfortunately, all that was lost to the ether, and we'll try again next time and see how it goes. So feedback is welcome on that. I'd like to thank Deborah and Patrick for calling in and helping me on the back end with the fact checking. So again, appreciated. So anyways, on to the news. First item for tonight is the state budget and education issues. We've talked a lot about Virginia's ongoing budget crisis with the $1.6 billion budget deficit. Virginia, of course, has a balanced budget amendment built into the Constitution. So a little tricky there. The governor does a 2-year budget, and there's been a lot of talk of cuts here and there and everywhere else. So a few articles about the Daily Press article that I have is about CNU bracing for budget cuts next year. But it's not just CNU that's bracing. It's all public colleges are facing a 7% cut in funding next year. And normally what happens in situations like this is that the tuition goes up. According to Governor McAuliffe's chief of staff, Paul Reagan, quote, the governor expects higher education institutions to make a concerted effort to identify real ongoing efficiencies and related savings for the fiscal year 2018, end quote. So basically what that means is that they're cutting the tuition, and they don't expect colleges to just simply raise tuitions. Continuing, tuition and fee increases beyond what was already being proposed in an institution's 6-year plan should not be considered as a mechanism to offset these reductions. So again, the governor does 2-year budgets, and the next one will be negotiated this upcoming General Assembly session starting in January, and will go into effect in July. According to the Daily Press, CNU's current budget is $160 million a year. The state share is $33.9 million, about 21%. So I'm not going to do the math there, but it's, obviously a considerable amount, and the colleges have to figure out where to cut. Now, not necessarily completely related, but I'll just try to stick with the theme of colleges here. There's a proposed bill in the House of Delegates which would mandate that public universities take in more in-state students. Now, this is from Delegate David Albo, a Republican from Springfield, who's introducing the bill this session. It's called HB 1410. It would require 75% of state students' undergraduate student bodies to be made of students from Virginia. And this is from the Virginia Gazette. Currently, College William & Mary and the University of Virginia, which is where Albo's gripe comes from, take about 2/3 of their students from in-state. the state's historically black colleges and universities, such as Norfolk State and Virginia State, would be exempted, as would VMI, Virginia Military Institute. And obviously, one of the problems that is going to get some pushback on this is that out-of-state students pay about twice as much. So if you mandate that in-state students, a quota system, if you will, then you are messing with the college funding. So go figure. And I guess I wouldn't be doing you a service talking about university news without talking about the contingent of students at University of Virginia who are trying to erase Thomas Jefferson from the university. This all started when UVA President Teresa Sullivan sent an email to the UVA community about the Trump win during the elections. She says, quote, "I wrote to encourage every member of our community to come together in a spirit of cooperation and civility after Election Day. I write today to underscore that message and to appeal to equanimity in our community following the outcome of this divisive election." She continues to quote Thomas Jefferson, saying that he, quote, "wrote to a friend that University of Virginia students are not of ordinary significance only. They are exactly the persons who are to succeed to the government of our country and to rule its future enmities, its friendships, and fortunes." End quote. A letter from UVA faculty and students said, quote, "We are incredibly disappointed in the use of Thomas Jefferson as a moral compass. In the spirit of inclusivity, we would like for our administration to understand that although some members of this community may have come to this university because of Thomas Jefferson's legacy, others of us came here in spite of us. For many of us, the inclusion of Jefferson quotes undermined the messages of unity, equality, civility, and inclusivity," having trouble with that word tonight, "that you are attempting to convey. We understand desires to maintain traditions at the university, but when these traditions threaten progress and reinforce notions of an exclusion, it's time to rethink their utility." And Sullivan responded, quote, "Words have power. To quote any person is to acknowledge the potency of that person's words. In my message last week, I agreed with Mr. Jefferson's words, expressing the idea that UVA students would help to lead our republic. He believed that 200 years ago, and I believe it today. Quoting Jefferson, or any historical figure, does not imply an endorsement of all the social structures and beliefs of his time, such as slavery and the exclusion of women and people of color from the university." So, end quote. I got to just fully disclose, I'm a huge fan of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and I think Clay Jenkinson has dealt with his weaknesses much better than I'm going to do right now, but I just don't know what to say. I mean, it just seems a bit much. I don't go to the university. Don't know too many people that have, especially not out of spite of Jefferson's legacy. But I don't know. Maybe I'm old. Maybe I'm feeling conservative. I don't know what you would call it, but to me, that just seems a bit much to reject Jefferson completely, even though he has his faults. But we'll see how it plays out. I can only imagine how the right is using this as ammo of liberalism's assault on free speech, or whatever you want to call it. I think it probably does more damage to our movement than anything else. I mean, you hear all this derision of safe spaces and all this stuff. I mean, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on it, because it seems like I would probably side with the UVA president. I mean, again, none of our historical figures are perfect, and to just completely dismiss all the good. I mean, that quote did not seem like it was objectionable. So, again, your thoughts are welcome. Let me know what you think. Moving on, we've talked a lot past couple weeks about the state police with regards to the state budget shortfall. State police, I believe, has over 100 vacancies right now for troopers because of poaching and just general disinterest in the position. I believe the state police salary for a starting trooper is about $35,000 a year. A lot of these guys can make way more money working for different municipalities. So just remember that next time you get pulled over for a traffic ticket on the freeway. But the budget is facing even more cuts because of the state troubles. And there's a lot going on this week with the House Appropriations Committee, the House Transportations Committee. Attrition and hiring are a big problem with them, and the Appropriations Committee, the House Appropriations Committee, is trying to restore the pay raises and budget cuts to the state police department. I don't have a whole lot about this tonight, but it's something to just keep in mind in the back of your head, as it may at some point start impacting public health and safety on the roadways. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Anyways, we're going to take a quick break. We'll come back with the rest of this week's news. This is the For Virginia Podcast. I'm Mike Wade. Stand by for more. Welcome back. This is the For Virginia Podcast. I'm Michael Wade. Show 13 for the week ending November 19th. We've got some new news, as we like to call it. First up is news about a class action lawsuit against the Department of Motor Vehicles. I'm sure this will be of great interest to many people. Going back to July 13th via the Washington Post, a suit filed July 6th against the Virginia Department of Motor Vehicles alleges the DMV indefinitely suspends driver's licenses of those too poor to pay fines and court costs in an unconstitutional scheme. Now, basically, the way it works in the state of Virginia, if you get a traffic ticket or moving violation, anything like that, and you either don't go to court, you can't pay your fine, they will suspend your license right off the bat. I've had it happen to me when I was younger. And basically what it boils down to, the lawsuit alleges that, quote, hundreds of thousands of people have lost their licenses simply because they are too poor to pay, effectively depriving them of reliable, lawful transportation necessary to get to and from work, take children to school, keep medical appointments, care for ill or disabled family members, or paradoxically, and this is key, I think, to meet their financial obligations to the court. So you have a person who can't afford to pay a fine, and you take away their ability to get to and from work. What happens? Right. Suspension of driver's licenses for non-payment can prevent people from keeping or obtaining jobs, leading to a vicious cycle of additional fines, unemployment, and sometimes incarceration. This is according to the Legal Aid Justice Center. Now, interestingly, this Washington Post article talks about the lead off on this is actually talking about Ferguson in 2014. Quote, a subsequent investigation revealed law enforcement acting as collection agents for state and local governments trying to raise revenue. Now, this is kind of a known secret, I guess, if you will. I mean, everybody pretty much assumes this. You know, you hear about towns like, I think, Emporia. Here comes the hate mail, I'm sure. Emporia, you know, people talk about traveling down 58 or I think 95 crosses through as well. So, you know, you're going through one of those two highways and you get to Emporia town limits, you better slow down because they're just sitting there waiting for you to go 5 miles over the speed limit. They're going to bust you with a ticket. And as a tangent for a minute here, I talk a lot about technology, automation, and so forth on outside of this podcast. But one of my main interests is automated cars, autonomous cars, Teslas and Google cars and stuff like that. And one of the things people really have to think about is what's going to happen to these municipalities that rely on traffic violations to get their money, and for that matter, parking fees and so forth. Once you have these self-driving cars all over the road and they don't run red lights and they don't speed, how are these municipalities going to keep their money streams rolling in instead of finding people and the poor? I don't really have a solution for it. I'm just asking you to consider the question for a moment. But back to the story. So what I just read you was from July 6th. They give a example of some of the class action defendants who, are unable to get medical treatment. Man who has got a liver disorder and can't get to a doctor. People who can't get on payment plans because they can't work. According to the suit, Virginia received $281 million in 1998, which grew to $618 million in 2014. $618 million in 2014, just from court fines and fees. The superintendent of the Albemarle Charlottesville Regional Jail, Colonel Martin Coomer, says, quote, "We have to stop locking people up because they are too poor to pay fines and court costs." Coomer started a program for inmates to pay back court costs with community service. Seems like a great idea. The reason we're bringing this up tonight is because the Department of Justice sides against the Virginia DMV over the suspension practices. According to the Associated Press, a team of Department of Justice civil rights lawyers filed a brief last week, this being last week, as of the time of the show, supporting the class action lawsuit against the DMV, saying the practice violates the U.S. Constitution's due process guarantee. Mark Herring has not made any public comments on this as far as I know. He wasn't quoted on the July article nor the November one either. So something to look out for. I mean, what is going to happen, or what will they do if they can no longer suspend your license for not paying fines? I mean, I guess they're just going to throw your butt in jail. I really don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how this one plays out, that's for sure. Next item. Headline, 18 companies ask Virginia for regulatory certification. So Microsoft, Walmart, Best Buy, IKEA, Staples, and 13 other companies have asked the Virginia State Corporation Commission to create a, quote, explicit legal framework, end quote, for expanding access to renewable energy from utilities and third-party suppliers. So Appalachian Power requested public comment on a 100% renewable energy rider that is before the State Corporation Commission. The companies apparently see the request as an attempt to tamp down on competition from third-party power providers. Trade Group maintains that Appalachian wants to engineer a situation in which the total amount of renewable power in the state does not increase. Quote, the trade association partly opposes the rider because APCO, Appalachian Power Company, is relying on existing wind and hydroelectric power in its portfolio, all from other states, to meet the renewable requirements rather than building new renewable generating capacity. Now, we saw an article about Dominion rolling out some solar elsewhere in the state. I didn't actually save it, so I don't have it in front of me. But the crux of the matter, I think, is that the power companies are trying to maintain their monopoly on power. And I know Dominion is guilty of doing everything they can to prevent consumer commercial rooftop solar. And we'll see what Tesla has to say about that with their new rooftop solar, their solar roofs rather. But we'll see how that one plays out as well. And not everything was bad last week with the election. Trump won. Democrats got tossed out of the Senate, apparently, but we did have one good win. Donald McEachin won a House of Representatives seat. And so he's had to vacate his state Senate seat, which opens up for a special election. Delegate Jennifer McClellan of Richmond has announced Monday that she is running for the state Senate seat. There is no date for the special election as of yet. But of course, as with all things in Virginia, you have a state senator move up to the House of Representatives. You have a delegate move up to state Senate seat. So obviously there will be another delegate race opened up, special election. We had several of those this past Tuesday. Mike Mullen won his spot in Newport News. Monty Mason won the state Senate seat of John Miller. And I think everybody else kept theirs. All the Democrats kept their seats. Not aware of any other Republican-held General Assembly seats that were up last week. But I'm guessing McClellan's seat is pretty safe D, so might not be too much to worry about. But we'll see who lines up to get in on that. Next item, via the Daily Press, Virginia ABC sales and profits are up once again. Gross sales increased almost $50 million, about 6%, to $898 million. Profits rose $13 million, 8%, 8.6%, to $165 million. That's $165 million in straight profit that the state rakes in each year from alcohol sales. Meanwhile, the state is still spending about $160 million on marijuana prohibition, not to mention the amount of individuals who are incarcerated with a loss to their income and freedom. I'll leave that there. But I will note that a hemp crop was harvested in Virginia for the first time in decades. I believe it was last year the General Assembly provided a special waiver, or whatever you want to call it, for a research program to remove to allow hemp cultivation. So maybe we will actually see some of the legal barriers removed and have a nice little cash crop in the state. Research programs are underway at Virginia Tech, Virginia State University, and James Madison. The Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services imported 16 varieties of hemp seed and issued licenses to 29 people to grow hemp this year as part of the research program. A total of 37 acres were planted this year on plots in 6 counties. And some of our listeners may be interested to know that the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel has secured $756 million in funding for an expansion. Construction is planned to start next October. Funding comes from a $338 million federal bond program and $321 million from a revenue bond. Additional funding comes from a state bond and the Chesapeake Bay Bridge and Tunnel District's general fund. So that will be an interesting project to watch happen. There's also been approval of a project for the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, which has caused a little controversy over at Hampton University. They have a large oak tree they call Emancipation Oak, which was where they read the Emancipation Proclamation back in the 1800s. So the tree is still there, and they consider it sort of I'm not sure it's a national monument. It's definitely important to the university, and they were worried that the expansion of the bridge tunnel over there was going to cause them to have to tear it down. I'm sure they were going to fight that tooth and nail. Would not have looked good. But yeah, Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel next year, We'll get 2 more lanes across the Thimble Shoals. And there's really a lot more to talk about this week, but we're going to have to leave the headlines there for today, and we're going to take a short break, come back, and we're going to talk about our main story, which is about the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Our main story tonight comes to us from several different sources. We've got articles in the Daily Press, the Virginian Pilot, the Roanoke Times, Richmond Times-Dispatch, all talking about this. The Virginia Economic Development Partnership was started in July 1995. The basic premise was to offer economic incentives for businesses to come into Virginia and bring jobs. So no doubt you've seen articles over the past 20 years and probably forever, about a particular program from the governor or whatever, bringing X amount of jobs to the state through some company. We just had one here in Hampton, not just this week, that was claiming X amount of jobs for a call center for a government contractor. What's made news this week is that a report by JLARC, which is the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission, it's basically a watchdog agency. JLARC's job is basically to look at how money is spent, tax subsidies, and other kind of payouts to business, and determine whether or not they've been economically effective. My previous run-in with JLARC was with regards to an audit they did of the coal tax subsidies that found that they were basically ineffective in their stated goal of providing coal jobs to the state. So JLARC came out with a scathing report on Monday that basically found that the Virginia Economic Development Partnership operated for more than 20 years without, quote, a formal due diligence process to protect the state from fraud and loss. It was a 132-page report that we're linking out here for you guys. We'll just run through them. We'll run through the articles, that is. So the pilot states that Virginia's been vulnerable to fraud for more than 2 decades. Mismanagement and lax oversight at the state's primary agency for spurring business expansion have left Virginia vulnerable to fraud for more than 2 decades, according to an audit released Monday. The Virginia Economic Development Partnership, which doles out millions in economic development incentives, ignores basic management and marketing practices and uses an inconsistent and unstructured approach to grant programs that exposes the state to potential fraud, according to the report by JLARC. Most of the Economic Development Agency's budget comes from the state's general fund. That includes $27 million in fiscal year 2017 for 111-member staff in marketing. Most staff members earn higher salaries than similar state employees. The previous CEO's base salary was about $279,000. The 24-member supervisory board is appointed by the governor and General Assembly. The pilot follows up with a headline that 23 companies that got state grants in Virginia failed to meet performance requirements. The state should have recouped an estimated $8.7 million, but the agency in charge didn't seek to recover the money. So basically, the way that this stuff works is that a company will have a proposal to bring in a certain number of jobs into the state. They'll say, okay, you guys give us, $6 million and we'll bring 830 jobs into the area over the next 4 years or something like that. So the problem is most of the time it doesn't happen. I think I have an article here from Roanoke Daily Press Roanoke.com seems to have been the catalyst on this with a report they did back in January that kind of spurred the JLARC investigation. Is what my take on all this is. From the pilot, projects that didn't meet performance requirements. An audit of the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, which administers grants, found 23 projects in which a company did not meet all 3 performance requirements, yet the state didn't seek to recover grant money as it should have done. So they mention Philip Morris, Northrop Grumman, Canon here in Newport News, Rolls-Royce, a couple others, Rubbermaid, and none of the others are really familiar to me. I think I mentioned most of the big ones. Noblis, NOBLIS / Center for Applied High Performance Company in Danville got $1 million. Everybody else was in the couple hundreds of thousands. Now, the Economic Development Agency does appear to have made some efforts to collect in some cases, but not to the extent that they should have, is what these articles are claiming, or what this audit is claiming, rather. Companies in question were involved in projects across the state. They include Philip Morris USA, now within Altria, which won approval for a $3 million grant from a fund administered by the Economic Development Partnership to create a research and training technology center in Richmond. Roanoke.com seems to have spurred this off back in July with some kind of expose that they did. Now, there's one particular company here that is really worth mentioning. The Lindenberg Industry, which was a company owned by Chinese nationals that received $1.4 million in state taxpayer money to start a catalytic converter plant in Appomattox. The factory never opened. Now, what is really telling about this company is that, quote from the Roanoke Times, officials at the partnership recommended approval of the grant, largely basing their faith in the project on a website filled with text and photos pulled from the web pages of an unrelated company. The site listed a physical address in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where, the newspaper found, the company had never been located. Now, I have another line in the Daily Press here that talks about the same issue. So, the state didn't ask for any financial statements from the company until much later after the deal soured. North Carolina, by the way, passed on backing that company the year before. It did so after one official drove by the address the company gave for its U.S. offices and found that it wasn't there. And today's Sunday paper for the Daily Press, I have it here in my hands, has a scathing editorial about this. I just want to read you a few choice words here. Under the headline, aiming for jobs but firing blank. So, quote, over the past decade, we are talking about some $384 million of your money. As a reminder, this spring, the Daily Press found promises of jobs and investment weren't met 1/3 of the time. Now, I can guarantee you that after reading this and after seeing this report in the newspaper about this other job center that they're opening up, I really want to go back and investigate and see what other claims have been made in my area about company X bringing jobs to the city, because we're talking about a state level agency, and it's really important that we think about what the actual cities and counties are doing, because this type of deal making happens all the time. And I really want to know if my tax dollars that go to the city of Hampton are being used for economic development, quote unquote, that those promises are being delivered. And I'd like to really see how that report card measures up, or if anybody's even bothered to check. So, continuing with the press, we note that economic development records and discussions of economic development grants are among the secrets that are most fiercely protected under Virginia's Freedom of Information Act. Just FYI, the Daily Press is real big on open government transparency records. I've seen article after article from them about that. They are very staunch supporters of open government. Continuing, lack of openness has a cost. This doesn't just happen because of slovenliness. It doesn't just happen because a loophole in the Freedom of Information Act exempts a public body from public scrutiny and accountability. It happens because of a basic misunderstanding about the role of government in promoting the economic well-being of a state. It happens when economic development comes down to bragging about how a governor, plenty of governors from both parties for 2 decades now, brings jobs to Virginia. What brings jobs to Virginia? What brings jobs here? What keeps jobs here? What encourages employers here to add jobs here is the high quality and relatively modest cost of the services employers need in order to do business. Things like roads without potholes or traffic jams, schools that teach kids to stretch the reading, math, and thinking talents they'll need in the work world, the kind of social safety net that helps the neediest potential employees, people working their way off welfare or struggling to cope with illnesses when they don't have health insurance, ready themselves to be productive employees and full participants in our civic life. And they end with, there aren't as many headlines in that, we suppose, from the daily editors of the Daily Press. So kudos to them for that. So I encourage everybody to share this news. I'm sure a lot of people are unaware of it. And think about that the next time you see your city council or local newspaper announcing XYZ Corp bringing 700 jobs to, the town of Danville or town of Lynchburg or whatever. So keep that in mind. And that's why we're here, spreading the word. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to have our shame and fame close out the show. Stay tuned. From the Loudoun Times this week comes a story about Virginia State Delegate Jim Lemunyan, representative from the 76th District, who sent and quickly deleted a tweet mocking millennials and anti-Donald Trump protesters Thursday night. The tweet in question was an article from the Babylon Bee with the headline, "Police Calm Millennial Protesters by Handing Out Participation Trophies." Babylon Bee is a Christian news satire site, sort of like The Onion. The tweet was deleted within minutes. Lemunyan claims that he intended to send the headline to his millennial children, but accidentally hit the Twitter icon on his phone instead. Legitimate mistake, and we don't necessarily disparage the delegate for sending it or finding it amusing or anything like that. We are discouraged about what it says about his feelings for the protesters in general, and what is of more concern are some of the comments that are associated with the Loudoun Times article. Now, anybody who's been on the internet as long as me knows that you never read the comments on YouTube or apparently on the Loudoun Times. For this week's shame, we wanted to direct our target towards the number of people across the country over the past week and a half now that have disparaged or mocked or ridiculed people exercising their First Amendment rights. People who make joke about safe spaces or call millennials crybabies or disparage people who have genuine feelings of fear over the results of 11/9. Now, there is no doubt in my mind that if Hillary Clinton had won the election, that we would have seen similar behavior from the right. In fact, I saw plenty of it before the election was even over. People calling themselves patriots that were ready to stand up and preserve our government from tyranny, who, by whatever fluke of the Electoral College or whatever you want to call it, wherever you want to lay the blame, rather, are on the other side of the fence and are gleefully gloating about the president-elect. And, there's a lot of people that are calling out protesters, rioters, noting the fact that some of these people didn't even vote in the election, all of which are legitimate points. But do not supersede the fact that our First Amendment of the United States protects the right to free speech. And I had someone even posted a Breitbart article about Obama encouraging rioters because he made a quote encouraging people to continue to exercise their free speech. And I, for one, am glad of the people that are able to go out and march on the street. I mean, we had consecutive weekends of marches in downtown Norfolk. I know the one last weekend was fairly big, got a little rowdy. Not sure that this week was as effective, but beyond the burning cars or whatever happened over in the Pacific Northwest, I believe it was Oregon or Washington State, I'm not sure, Seattle maybe, people have a right to be outraged. And I think we've got to learn from this election. And by we, I mean people that call themselves Democrats or progressives or liberals or whatever. Not sure the soul searching is done. You know, the leadership shakeup, not only within the DNC. I think we had Sam Razul step down from his leadership position within the Democratic Party of Virginia, one of the caucus maybe. I know within my own local Democratic Party Democratic committee that the leadership positions were all voted on last winter, and they're 2-year terms. So probably not going to be a whole lot of changeover within the state committees themselves, but within the state party itself, we'll see what happens. But again, I think based on what we are seeing from the president-elect's appointments and decision-making with regards to his financial business partners, blind trust, or you can't even call it blind trust, but Robert Reich is definitely calling it out, and there's a lot of people on Twitter who are calling it out, and my Facebook feed is full of people calling it out, and we should continue to call it out, and especially because of the fact that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. I think it's somewhere near 2 million right now. We need to remember that there is no mandate for the Trump administration, and we need to call it out when people say that the people have spoken, because only 25% of registered voters in the United States voted for Trump. Maybe less, maybe more by a little percentage one way or the other. But we had, 49% of registered voters stick out of this election? And a majority of those that did vote voted for Hillary Clinton. So to call a Trump mandate is disingenuous. And I heard something earlier today, some Trump supporter spokesperson saying that Trump was facing one of the most dire economic situations of any president since Truman because of the debt to GDP ratio. And it's just so funny because the past 8 years of Obama, all we've heard is deficit, debt. And already they've forgotten that and have just ready to give all the money to the wealthy. And so it's more important than ever for us to stick up and stand up and shout and scream. And if you want to call it moaning and complaining and whining, I don't call it that. We need to challenge all of these tests, allegiance tests, or whatever you want to call it. There's a person on Twitter I follow that basically called the Bannon appointment an obedience test. If you pass the obedience test, then another test follows, even more striking and even more damaging than the one before that. Whether you want to call it fascism, totalitarianism, whatever you want to call it, it's important that we call it. As Republicans are wont to say, you must name your enemy. But I've always said that we have more to fear by homegrown terrorism, white nationalism, than we do from any Islamic terror. And we've seen it with a number of violent acts against people of color, Muslims, LGBTs. We've really got to stand out. So for this week, my shame is pointed at the people who would mock and belittle and demean people exercising their First Amendment rights, the press that would normalize the Trump presidency, white nationalism, racism. And my fame for this week goes to the people that are standing up against that. Fame for the hundreds that marched on Norfolk on November 11th, chanting against Trump in solidarity with minorities and people that are not like themselves. The 200 that rallied in Blacksburg after the election, welcoming refugees. To all of the high school students that left classes, including Harrisonburg, 80 students that marched 3 miles in the rain, chanting "Build Love, Not Hate." Our hearts go out to everyone who has the time and the will to go out and do these things. And we must stay strong. We must stand up and we must resist racism, Islamophobia, homophobia. We must resist the mainstream media's attempt to normalize this deplorable behavior that we see coming from the alt-right. Future of our country depends on it. These slogans, I want you to remember and I want you to repeat. Despair is not an option. We must continue to get involved in any way we can. And remember that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires action. I've taken the step to run for local office because for me, that's the best way that I can do at this point in time, besides just arguing with people on Facebook or Twitter. But if you can get out there in March, if you can boycott some of these companies, whatever you can do, if you want to pray, pray. I, for one, hope that Ruth Bader Ginsburg lives a long and prosperous life, as well as the rest of the Supreme Court justices. And another thing that I want to mention before we close tonight, a friend of mine lost his wife recently, and I didn't know it when I read his Facebook post, but he said, I'm going to take the time to focus on things that are important to me. I'm going to take a break from social media. And I didn't realize that his wife had passed away, but what I told him, I responded, I said, you know what's important to me right now is politics. And we've had this huge amount of attention the past year and a half over this presidential election and now the result. And for most of America, I would say a majority of Americans, they just want to turn it off, go on with their lives. They really didn't see a difference between Hillary or Trump. They didn't feel like voting. They made a protest vote against one or the other. And that is a huge failure, not only of the press, but of ourselves for not being able to either listen to people who are inclined to not vote or vote for Trump. It's a huge failure by the Democratic Party for coronating a candidate instead of listening to the populist Bernie supporters. I'm not going to argue whether or not he could have won. That's not a good that's a waste of time at this point. Not constructive. But now that the election is over, a majority of people just want to forget about politics and just go on with their lives. But we cannot afford to wait 4 years or even 2 years or really even 1 year for Virginia elections next year. It's too long. We have to fight every day against this behavior, against the kind of behavior that we saw during the campaign from the candidate Trump. We have to resist, again, the media trying to normalize this behavior. And we have to not only do we have to keep people interested in every single appointment, every single decision, and they're coming fast and furious, and we've got a very small window in this country to make a stance and stand against what's going on, because it could be over by the time Trump is even inaugurated. He refuses to put his business dealings in a blind trust. He's invited his children to meetings with heads of state. He's even discussing American business or American policy or whatever you want to call it over the phone with these foreign nationals. After all of this outrage over Hillary Clinton's email, and here is Donald Trump, using a regular landline or cell phone, speaking with the Russians or the Saudis or whoever. Just had a huge meeting with them in New York. And I could go on and on and on about it. But beyond making sure that we are vigilant about every single move that they make, we have to take better steps to educate ourselves and our friends and family about what is acceptable truth in this country. You hear all of this stuff recently about the fake news, how it contributed to the election results. And one of the strengths of totalitarian regimes or fascism or however you want to call it is this distortion or this confusion surrounding what is true. So you've got fact checkers checking and people dismissing Snopes as a liberal site. You've got news that you can select to back up your viewpoint. But even more important is that we weed out all of the chaff. Some of these sites that might actually further our viewpoint, but are nothing more than link bait or clickbait ad generator sites. I saw it so many times. Occupy, Democrats, bipartisan report, which is not really bipartisan at all. US Uncut, I think, is another that is kind of questionable on my list. There's lists floating around social media, and I keep seeing them over and over again. And usually the article is something along the lines of X says Y, et cetera, et cetera. And usually it's just a rehash of a post to another, Washington Times, New York Post, or wherever. They're just basically telling you what somebody else reported, and they're throwing it up on pop-ups and ad buys and all that other stuff. So quit sharing that kind of stuff. Go to the original source. Post the original source. If the ACLU prints a front page ad in the New York Times with a letter to Donald Trump, don't post a US Uncut or a bipartisan report article telling you about the ACLU ad. Post the ACLU ad. Quit feeding the trolls. Quit feeding these link bait sites that don't add anything substantial to the democratic debate or to the education of people. Don't post an article about a New York Times article. Post the New York Times article. Check your primary sources. And it goes for everybody, left, right, wherever. I'll call it out as I see it. Anyways, that's all the time we have for tonight. We appreciate everyone that's tuned in. We thank you for all your support and all your shares. So please check out our website, share us on social media, and your financial support is always appreciated. This is the For Virginia Podcast, episode 13. Please submit your feedback on our website, on Facebook, or by emailing info@forvirginia.org. We'll continue working hard to bring you the news, information, and analysis to help keep the progressive revolution moving forward in Virginia through 2017 and beyond. My name is Michael Brennan Wade. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.